Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, folks. We have a new effed up story for you tonight. 2 nights in a row. I know it's not very much like us, but it's something we're going to try to do more often. And tonight we have a submission coming from Steve Lamb. And Steve Lamb's story, it's I'll give it to you this way. You've heard those stories where you end up in a place that's supposedly haunted, and then you end up leaving, but the haunting comes with you. Classic case, right? Well, that's Steve Lamb's story in a nutshell, but it's a little more interesting than that, of course, involving all kinds of, I guess, poltergeist-like activity. So before we get into that, I'd just like to shout out the old phrasing. If you have an effed up story of your own on the paranormal, or if you have pictures or video, we would like you to submit that to us, which you can do on our official site. It's effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. We're taking all your stories, we're putting them on the website, and then we're putting them in podcasts. So if that's something that interests you, if you want to get your story out there, we'd like to help. So again, go to effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Get us your story, and we'll get it out there. And with that said, we're going to jump into Steve Lamb's story, which, by the way, on the site is called Darkness There and Nothing More, if you like to read the original. So Steve begins, before he even jumps into a story, the thing that caught his eye is something that I've said numerous times in many podcasts. And what it is that people who experience the paranormal, they don't often have one story. People who experience the paranormal, more often than not, their lives are peppered throughout with this kind of activity. And this resonated with Steve Lamb because that's exactly how he felt. His life is peppered throughout. So this is just but one of his many stories, and this is his earliest story. Now, this actually took place when he was about 9 or 10 years old. And he was living in Sellersville, Pennsylvania. And at this time, like a lot of kids do at that age, he had joined a Club Scout. And his best friend, of course, was in there too. His name was Tyler. And every Tuesday and Thursday, just for some kind of friendly and fun activity, they would get together and do stuff. So one day in the summer, they all met at this local church. Steve said it was around 5 p.m. And the whole idea here was that the parents and the scout leaders were they were planning a weekend trip. So about 2 hours after they had been there, it starts getting dark, and their little group consisted of 7 guys, and including Steve. And they decide to walk around this graveyard, which was right around where the church they were near. And of course, as is always the case with these groups, a couple of the guys wanted to scare the other guys, so they come up with this ghost story, which Steve said was similar to like the Headless Horseman story, but they insisted it was something unique. You know, one of those bullshit stories that I've told my siblings many times just to spook them, and I'm sure lots of our listeners have probably done the same or have been told.
The made up ghost story that you hear at whatever local summer camp you go to.
Yeah, you basically, well, you know how it is. I mean, you've probably told your share of bullshit stories to your brother and or friends or anyone, really, just to spook them, because it's fun. It's fun to give those stories. Anyway, so that's what these kids are doing to Steve and his friend Tyler and a couple of the other kids. And anyway, every one of the other kids, except for Steve and Tyler, they were spooked by the idea. You know, they didn't really want to be around the graveyard. They really didn't want to run into some kind of a headless specter. But Tyler and Steve, I guess, like you and me, Ryan, were interested to see it. So they actually, as the other kids had, kept going and left where the cemetery was, Tyler and Steve, and actually there was another kid too. There was 3 of them. They walked back and they continued to walk around the cemetery. And eventually they found this small, it was a stuffed rabbit, like a toy stuffed rabbit. And it was lying against one of the tombstones. And Steve said he didn't really understand why it was there at the time. But he ended up picking it up, and he gave it to his friend Tyler to, just, I guess, look it over. And they ended up bringing it back to the rest of the group. And when his friend Tyler had, he was holding the rabbit, when he held it out, of course, all the kids at once grabbed this thing. And you can already see what happened. They all ripped at it and tore it apart. Tyler was holding the body, and he ended up with a leg. Someone else ended up with an arm. And they all kind of just laughed at how fast this thing just got ripped apart. It's just like bringing it to a group of piranhas. And each one of the people in this group ended up pocketing a different part of this dismembered bunny. So now Steve didn't actually have a piece of it. He ended up going home empty-handed, but Tyler had a piece of it. So anyway, after this excitement of this bullshit dismemberment of a stuffed rabbit goes away, after this is done, they go back. The parents had planned the weekend getaway, and they go home. Now you fast forward to the next night, and Steve is over at Tyler's house, and they live really close together, by the way. And they're playing video games. It sounds almost like something from my youth, actually. And anyway, when Steve was getting ready to go home, he said he stood up, and as soon as he stood up, he heard the sound of fingernails very loudly ringing across the middle of the door, scratching it, and it just rang out throughout the room. And he said himself and Tyler, they both looked at each other and they called out, "Who is it?" And they kind of expected it to be either their parents or Tyler's parents or his older sister or younger sister, someone just playing a prank. And of course they got no reply. So Tyler, he got up and he opened the door. And of course, there was nothing there. It was just a dimly lit hallway. So they just assumed that it was a prank, right? They left it at that, and Steve went home. So the next night, Steve goes back over to Tyler, and Tyler asks him, if he wanted to stay over. And of course, they did. They'd get together, they played video games. It was fun, right? So Steve ends up at Tyler's house that night, and they're playing video games. And Tyler's older sister, Amanda, was there as well. And she was watching them play, and they were just talking about shit, like music and stuff that they watch on TV. And anyway, Steve asked Tyler if he had told Amanda about, the scratch that they heard on the door the night before. And, Tyler didn't tell her. So Steve ends up telling Amanda, what had happened. And of course, she denied that she knew anything about it. In fact, she acted surprised, and she was a little bit shaken by it. And she even said that the little sister couldn't have been the culprit because she was in bed by 6 o'clock in the night. So they really didn't have an answer for that. They did have a cat, but they said there's no way that the cat could have gotten to the area of the door that this happened, because Steve did say it was in the middle of the door and it was really slowly rang out. It's just a cat would have to jump there and be really quick, right? So that didn't fit the profile either. So they just called it off as a weird one-off experience, and they left it at that and went off doing the rest of their evening. Later in that same night, Steve said it was around 8 o'clock. He again hears this loud, slow scratching, and it resonates from the door. Like it's just resonating and vibrating. And he said this time Amanda was in the room with them, and they said again the little sister, she was in bed by 6, and the parents had even gone to bed. So they really didn't have, they couldn't think of who could have been doing that as a prank or anything like that. And as this happened, they said they all just stood still. They were stunned. They were afraid. They were silent, and they were trying to listen for something on the other side of the door. Like, maybe it was the cat. They could hear the cat meow. Maybe it was another family member. They were really quiet and focusing, trying to get some kind of rationality from what was behind there. And anyway, they didn't open the door right away, I guess because it kind of freaked them out. But in any case, after 10 minutes or so, Tyler ends up opening the door. And of course, on the other side is blackness, as they all kind of expected it to be. And so then they all left the room and they walked into the dark hallway, and they get down to his parents' room to wake them up. And as they get down there, Steve waits outside of the room while Tyler goes in. Actually, Tyler and Amanda went in to wake up their parents. If, they wanted to ask them if somehow they were behind it. So Steve at this point is out in the hallway by himself. And, they give this, they just tell the kids, it wasn't them, go away, they're trying to go to sleep. And so they end up going back to Tyler's room. They close the door and they just speculate on what they think that this might be. It could have been a ghost. It could have been a demon. It could have been, some kind of cryptid creature. Maybe even a zombie. And after 5 minutes of this, they hear the slow creak again with the door. Here it is again. And at this moment, Steve said he got this phrase in his head that he thought only, it made him think of cartoons, right? He didn't think anyone would actually use this in real life. But he said, and I quote, "I think I hear my mom calling me," right? And so that's all he could get out. And he said he had to go, of course, saying that he wasn't scared. That's bullshit. I just got to go home. So he ends up leaving. He opens the door. He peers around the corner, of course, freaked out despite all things that he said. He runs down the stairs as fast as he could. He locks the door and he sprints home. So he gets home. It's comfortable there. It's well lit. And his parents were wondering, why he's home and not sleeping over at Tyler's house, right? I mean, did they have a fight or something, right? And he tells them everything that just happened. And of course, I expected, like, if I had told my mom something like that, she would have just said, "Oh, that's bullshit. The kids are tormenting you. It's not, whatever." But they go, "That's awesome and neat." And they were excited by it. And his sister was especially interested in the story. She actually wanted to go to Tyler's house the next night to see if she could witness it. So the next day, Tyler ends up going over to Steve's house, and they immediately, like, the first thing they do is jump on that topic. You know, what was scratching the door at his house? So he tells his sister about the scratching. And then they told a story about how they found this stuffed bunny in the cemetery. And they came to the conclusion that what they were dealing with was a poltergeist. And they assumed that when they had taken this bunny, perhaps the ghost of a young girl who perhaps owned this bunny, followed Tyler home. That's the idea that they had. Of course, Tyler forgot where he put the piece of the bunny that he had, and they never could find it. But anyway, they made up this plan, and they were going to hang out in his room that night and all try to experience this at the same time. And the plan was, once they heard the door again, which they seemed to, the clock into between 8 and 9 o'clock. That's when they experienced it the 2 previous nights. That's when they assumed it would happen again. So that was the plan. They were going to listen between 8 and 9 for the door, and as soon as they heard it, as fast as they humanly could possibly open it, Steve was going to open the door, and then Tyler was going to run out there and see what was actually behind this whole thing. So as night comes around, they're all hanging out in Tyler's room. The parents are asleep. The little sister was asleep. The cat was outside. So they had a perfect set of conditions here. So of course they, Steve and Tyler, they're playing video games, and as around 10 to 8 comes around, they turn off the TV and they position themselves. Steve had his, he was up, he was against the door, he had his hand on the knob, ready to just yank it open. And like clockwork, he said, at 8:02, they hear the scratching at the door. So Steve swings the door open as fast and as hard as he could. And actually, all 3 of the others jump out and stare into the hallway. And Steve said he quickly peered around the door, and again, there's nothing there. And to him, that was the scariest thing that could have been there. So they were all, pretty pumped about the experience that, I guess that you had witnesses. I mean, that's one of the biggest things if you've experienced paranormal activity, is that you want somebody to witness it with you. And they did. They had that whole group there witness this happen. And Steve said that this became practically a normal occurrence in Tyler's house. He said, this continued for months, and every time that scratching at the door would happen, which would even happen sometimes earlier in the day when it was still light out, they would just kind of pass it off. I mean, they learned to live with it as it was a normal occurrence. And they got to the point where Steve would just get up, he'd open the door and leave it open, and that was the only way that they could get the scratching to stop. Now, Steve did elaborate a little further and say that other strange things started to happen around the house. Like he said, there was this one time he was playing video games as usual, and they had a Nintendo GameCube, if you can remember that old system. And he said that the power adapter, where it was plugged into the wall, it just flew out as if with force, right? Just someone yanked it out of the wall. But of course, nobody was there to do it. He said he also heard the sound of a little girl's voice on the other side of a basement door. And sometimes that handle to the basement door would jiggle. And anyway, eventually the activity died down and went away entirely. And the only thing that remains of that whole experience, according to Steve, was scratch marks, which appears to be from 4 nails down the middle of Tyler's door. So what was it that they had experienced? Did they actually, I mean, I know that they assumed that it was, a ghost of a young girl that was attached to a stuffed doll that they found at a cemetery. That's all speculation. But at the same,
I mean, obviously, kids find something in a graveyard, they're immediately going to assume that it's, belonging to somebody deceased. But let's face it, it's not like it, the toy. It's highly unlikely. I mean, if you're buried in a graveyard, chances are you weren't playing in the graveyard the day before and left your toy there.
Yeah, but at the same time, it does seem like, unless this activity had happened prior, which Steve didn't mention, it seemed to all correlate to, this one time that they were in the graveyard. So it does seem like they had attracted some kind of a spirit, and it followed them home to Tyler's house specifically, which was interesting. I know that earlier in the story he said that, and I guess they based this on the kind of doll it was, but they said that they believed it was the ghost of a young girl. Now, it was interesting that at the end of the story, the basement door, they would hear the voice of a young girl on the other side, and of course the knob would jiggle. So
I think one of the weirdest parts of the story for me is that this Tyler kid's parents go to bed at 7:00. I mean, who the hell does that? That's that would be the bizarre. Like, dude, what the hell's wrong with your parents? Are they narcoleptics?
I once
7:00 at night.
I once worked with a girl that she went to bed at 9, and I thought that was strange. So,
but here's this kid. They
well, yeah, why parents go to bed before the kids when?
Yeah, well, exactly. It's like, all right, kids, you take care of things, make sure the house is locked up, and you get the cat inside. Your mom and I are going to bed at 7:00.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah.
But, well, I mean, when it comes to the whole haunting phenomenon, spirits being attached to objects is a pretty common theme. Usually it's some sort of very personal item, like grandpa's favorite rocking chair, and every night at midnight the rocking chair begins rocking on its own, or something to that effect. I wonder, if perhaps the destruction of the toy may have been, part of what caused this kind of activity as well. Of course, anything, and I guess the other thing is that if it was a toy, just a random toy that was left in a graveyard, perhaps a family that was visiting a relative or something, took their kid along, the kid, of course, being kids, dropped their stuff and just, walked away. Perhaps a spirit came across said toy and kind of attached to it post-mortem, as it were, something that it recognized or found comfort in, and attached itself to it afterwards.
I think that's a pretty plausible explanation within the realm of the paranormal, at least. What I find interesting, and because there's just so many stories, it's always a scratching. I don't know what it is about a scratching, but it seems that a lot of people who experience the paranormal, you don't hear banging as often, or you know what I mean? Like, it's often a scratching. Now, at least in Steve's story, it was 4 fingernail scratches and not 3, which is what we always hear. And of course, we assume that that's demonic activity, 3 and the mocking the tritone and all those things. But if I were a ghost, I guess I think of something bigger to get someone's attention than scratching. Maybe.
Well, it seems like quite an act of desperation, doesn't it? human beings aren't really known for their ability to scratch and dig at stuff with their nails.
Unless you were buried alive, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, in instances where if you were to see human finger scratches in a wall, you're going to assume that it was something quite desperate, and if you have, and perhaps that's a link to perhaps frustration being felt by the spirit. Maybe it's trying to get somebody's attention. It can't, and out of frustration, it's scratching and pawing, and let's face it, we obviously don't know what it's like to be a spirit, because if we did, we wouldn't be here. But from all accounts, your ability to interact with the physical world is quite limited. And if that were the case, I could understand perhaps a confused spirit or a frustrated, angry spirit becoming even more frustrated and even more angry at its, maybe it can see the world around it to some extent, but then not being able to interact with it. Well, that would be a form of torture all its own, wouldn't it?
Well, two things that I think. First of all, maybe it's like the movie Ghost, and that the energy that it takes, or the focus that it takes to interact with physical objects as a spirit is really difficult. So maybe they don't have enough focus or ability to move a door, but they could, maybe pick up something small like a pebble and scratch the door with it or something. That's one thought. The other thought is, and I was just thinking of it, God damn my brain. What was it? Yes, maybe for them, as you said, it would be terrifying to be isolated and alone. And you remember how Steve said he liked to open the door, he would open the door and then the scratching would stop. Well, maybe all the spirit really wanted, like maybe he needed to be invited or something like that in order to exist in the same room as them, to hang out where they are. Like he needed some kind of permission, and maybe that's all he wanted, to not feel so alone, was just to hang out, or her, whatever, to hang out,
be included.
Yeah, to be included, to hang out and just exist vicariously through the people in the room. Maybe that's the whole thing right there. So I don't know why eventually this stopped and went away. Maybe, they do say that, spirits can find their way. In fact, that's a whole thing with near-death experiences I've been reading for weeks now, and eventually I'm going to want to do a podcast on a lot of these interesting ones. But, the whole idea that on the other end, once you pass over, you can still move up. You can still, like, I know level up is not the right word. I got video games on the brain, but you can improve yourself. Like, just because you're in a bad spot doesn't mean that you can't climb out of it, but usually the process takes a little longer. So some people that may be stuck here on Earth, that haven't, found their way, they haven't, have had their hero come and save them or open the door or whatever the case may be. They haven't worked through their problems yet. And maybe, as in the case with this spirit, she somehow or he somehow worked through their problems, or they called out to the right God, whatever the case may be,
and was able to move on.
They were able to move on and get out of there. So that's my theory. That's my speculation. And that's Steve Lamb's story. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. And of course, we are doing, like, again, I can't stress this enough, we want to do more user submissions. The show should be all about you guys and your stories that nobody else has ever heard before. That was the original intent, and that's definitely what we want to do. So if you have an effed up story of your own, pictures, video, we want it. go to our website and submit it to us at effedupstories.com. That's effedupstories.com. Go to the menu, submissions, fill out the form, hit it. We'll put it on the site, and eventually we'll get it in a podcast.
And for that matter, if you've submitted a story and it has made its way onto the website, but we haven't done a podcast on it yet, don't fret, don't worry. We're not doing these in any particular order. It's more or less we're reading through the backlog of material we have, and we're not so much selecting at random, but selecting ones that seem interesting to us at the time, something that catches our attention, because we feel that it will catch your attention as well. So eventually we hope to work through all of the submitted material that we have put up on the site and already posted. So I have seen some people make comments, and people have sent me messages, wondering why that they've been skipped over. You haven't been skipped over. Just it's going to take time for us to get through them all.
Yeah, ultimately this was I'm not going to say a new idea. We did mention it around, I don't know, October or November, because when we initially made this show, we kind of held ourselves to this idea that every show had to be an hour long, and the truth is every submission is not going to fill an hour. But we've gotten rid of that notion, and we're just gonna, as long as it takes, if it takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, we will put it out there, because unlike TV and radio, we don't really have a slot. It's however long it takes. And I do realize that there are those of you who are searching for shows that you do want to sit down for an hour. You want to sit down for an hour or two and just get lost in something. And I realize that because I do the same thing. I listen to shows and I do the same thing. But my suggestion is the fact that we have a playlist that has absolutely every episode that we've ever done. So if we're doing 3 and 4 in a week, and they were at 20 minutes a pop, if you like, you can just put on that playlist and sit there for an hour and listen to the last 3 or 4 or 5 that we did, and that's your hour podcast. This way there's no filler, there's no unnecessarily rambling. I realize I'm kind of doing that now. But it should be much more to the point, kind of like a novel of short stories, rather than this big film that got a lot of detail that don't really matter. And we still will do the big shows from time to time. It's just understand that our time is limited, and this lets us do these shows a lot more often, and it also lets us put you guys in the limelight, which initially was the idea behind the show. So again, if you guys have stories, get them to us. And that said, thank you for listening.
Have a great night, everybody.
But the haunting comes with you. Classic case, right? Well, that's Steve Lamb's story in a nutshell, but it's a little more interesting than that, of course, involving all kinds of, I guess, poltergeist-like activity. So before we get into that, I'd just like to shout out the old phrasing. If you have an effed up story of your own on the paranormal, or if you have pictures or video, we would like you to submit that to us, which you can do on our official site. It's effedupstories.com. That's effedupstories.com. We're taking all your stories, we're putting them on the website, and then we're putting them in podcasts. So if that's something that interests you, if you want to get your story out there, we'd like to help. So again, go to effedupstories.com. That's effedupstories.com. Get us your story, and we'll get it out there. Hello, folks. we have a new effed up story for you tonight. 2 nights in a row. I know it's not very much like us, but it's something we're going to try to do more often. And tonight we have a submission coming from Steve Lamb. And Steve Lamb's story, it's I'll give it to you this way. You've heard those stories where you end up in a place that's supposedly haunted, and then you end up leaving. He was about 9 or 10 years old. And he was living in Sellersville, Pennsylvania. And at this time, like a lot of kids do at that age, he had joined a Club Scout. And his best friend, of course, was in there too. His name was Tyler. And every Tuesday and Thursday, just for some kind of friendly and fun activity, they would get together and do stuff. So one day in the summer, they all met at this local church. Steve said it was around 5 p.m. And the whole idea here was that the parents and the scout leaders were they were planning a weekend trip. So about 2 hours after they had been there, it starts getting dark, and their little group consisted of 7 guys, and including Steve. And they decide to walk around this graveyard, which was, like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
And with that said, we're going to jump into Steve Lamb's story, which, by the way, on the site is called Darkness There and Nothing More, if you like to read the original. So Steve begins, before he even jumps into a story, the thing that caught his eye is something that I've said numerous times in many podcasts. And what it is that people who experience the paranormal, they don't often have one story. People who experience the paranormal, more often than not, their lives are peppered throughout with this kind of activity. And this resonated with Steve Lamb because that's exactly how he felt. His life is peppered throughout. So this is just but one of his many stories, and this is his earliest story. Now, this actually took place when he was